Welcome to the deep dive. Have you ever found yourself watching a blockbuster movie, maybe scrolling through news headlines, or even just, listening to a song and realizing, wait a minute, this isn't just entertainment.
Mm.
This is subtly, but actually quite powerfully shaping how I see the world, how I understand global conflicts, other cultures, maybe even my own place in it all.
It's a really profound observation, isn't it? What you're touching on there is, well, it's the heart of what we call popular geopolitics.
Okay.
Imagine practical geopolitics that's like the high-stakes chess match played behind closed doors by governments. The treaties, the military plans, the
Yeah, the
sanctions.
official stuff.
Exactly. Popular geopolitics, then, is how those complex, often kind of opaque chess moves get translated, how they're simplified into the stories, the songs, the movies, the news headlines that reach your living room.
Ah, so it's the filter.
It is the filter. It's how abstract foreign policy becomes relatable, understandable, and this is crucial, emotionally resonant for loads of people every single day.
Absolutely, and that's precisely what we're going to try and unravel in this deep dive. We've gone through a really fascinating collection of sources, and our mission today is really to pull back the curtain on how media influences our understanding of global events, of identities, revealing some of the hidden power struggles that are embedded right there in our daily information consumption.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that what we consume isn't just neutral information, it's constructed, it's framed.
Framed, okay.
And it has these profound implications for how we perceive global events, who we see as allies or adversaries, even our own role on the world stage.
Right.
So as we navigate this discussion, we really encourage you, the listener, to think about your own media signature.
Your media signature, like your media diet.
Sort of, yeah. That unique, often unconscious mix of news, entertainment, information you consume, and how you might be absorbing these really potent geopolitical messages without even realizing it.
It's a journey into seeing the invisible architects, perhaps.
That's a great way to put it, seeing the invisible architects behind our global understanding.
So let's unpack this. Our first section is all about these invisible architects.
Mm-hmm.
What is popular geopolitics, really, and how does it actually work its magic?
Right.
Or maybe its manipulation?
Well, at its core, popular geopolitics is exactly that intersection. It's where the concrete actions of foreign policy, those real-world decisions and strategies, meet the compelling narratives and the evocative visuals that are so widely spread through mass media.
Okay.
It's where the grand strategies of nations, often cooked up in think tanks and government offices, filter down into the very stories we tell ourselves about the world. It's this constant, often subconscious negotiation between official policy and public perception.
And it goes deep. I was really struck by the international relations scholar Cynthia Weber's concept of moral grammars in films. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah, that's a powerful idea.
What does she mean by moral grammars? And how do films use them to subtly, or maybe not so subtly, shape how we understand threats? Maybe even drawing parallels to real-world events like September 11th.
It's definitely more than just a plot point. Think of moral grammars as the sort of invisible programming embedded in our entertainment. A film doesn't just show a villain, it meticulously crafts a reason for their villainy.
Right.
And it often subtly aligns that reason with real-world groups or ideologies.
Wow, okay.
And this process doesn't just entertain, it kind of dictates who we perceive as good or evil on a global stage. It turns complex geopolitical realities into these simple, morally charged narratives.
They stick with you.
Exactly. And they deeply shape our personal and collective identities. It's incredibly potent because we often absorb these lessons without even realizing we're being taught anything.
So these moral grammars in cinema, they don't just depict a threat.
No, they frame why that threat exists. They often draw implicit or even explicit connections to actual events, like, as you said, the aftermath of September 11th.
Yep.
They tell us who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and why certain actions are morally justifiable. It's like they provide a prepackaged lens.
Through which we process these big, shocking global events.
Precisely.
And it's not just big Hollywood films, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about a much broader scope here. Our sources make it clear that geopolitical ideas find expression in loads of other media.
Oh, absolutely.
Television, music, cartoons, the internet, radio. For most people, these are their primary ways of getting info about current affairs or even history.
Yeah.
Often much more accessible than, say, academic journals or official government reports.
Definitely. While blockbuster films often grab the headlines, these other media forms are equally, maybe even more important for accessing information about current affairs and past events for a huge global audience.
Their ubiquity makes them powerful.
Incredibly powerful tools in shaping our worldview. Think about how a catchy protest song can galvanize a movement, right? Or how political cartoons can distill really complex foreign policy into a single, searing, memorable image. These aren't just background noise, they're active participants in forming these popular geopolitical narratives.
So that idea of ubiquity, it immediately brings to mind the uneven distribution of that power. Our sources really hammer this home. It's far from a level playing field when it comes to global media access, isn't it?
Not at all. They certainly underscore that.
What are some of the big disparities the sources point out?
Well, you've got regions like North America, Europe, parts of Asia with just this bewildering array of media at their fingertips,
Yeah.
High-speed internet, endless channels.
Right.
But access remains incredibly patchy in other parts of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, still faces huge challenges with internet penetration.
Okay.
And if you connect this to the bigger picture, the United States still plays this massively significant role as the most important generator of web content.
Still, even now.
Still. And this isn't just about cat videos. It means a huge portion of the world's accessible digital information is filtered through an American, or at least an English-speaking, lens. The dominance of the English language online is a critical, often overlooked factor in shaping global information flows.
Something I found really surprising in our sources, and I think this might make some listeners pause and reflect, is how much young Americans, for a time at least, were getting their news from shows like Jon Stewart's The Daily Show.
Ah, yes. That comes up.
What does that tell us about how we define a news source now, or how complex issues are being consumed?
It raises a really important question about how different generations consume news and, the evolving definition of what even counts as a news source.
Right.
It highlights the way complex political issues can be packaged, maybe made more digestible and often entertaining in different formats.
So humor as a vehicle for news.
Exactly. For many young people, shows like The Daily Show offered not just humor, but also a critical, often satirical take on mainstream news. It let them engage with current events in a way that felt, authentic, relatable. The implication, of course, is that the humor often served as a kind of Trojan horse for some pretty substantial political commentary.
But maybe sacrificing nuance sometimes.
Yeah.
For the joke.
That's the potential downside, yes. Nuance can get lost in the punchline. And it's worth noting here, while our discussion will mostly pull examples from English language, media, Hollywood, BBC World Service, Voice of America, that kind of thing.
Sure.
We have to acknowledge that this is just a sliver of the global media pie. Media from other parts of the world, in countless other languages, plays an equally vital role in shaping their audience's geopolitical understanding.
Absolutely. Acknowledged. Okay, so we've talked about how media subtly shapes our worldview. But what happens when governments step directly into the role of broadcasters? When they explicitly try to shape those views? This next section really brings that into sharp focus.
Yeah, this is where it gets really overt. A prime example of this kind of public diplomacy in action straight from our sources is the creation of Radio Farda.
Radio Farda. That means tomorrow in Farsi, right?
That's right. It was established in Prague back in December 2002. And crucially, it was funded directly by the U.S. State Department.
No ambiguity there, then.
None at all. Its purpose was clear from the start. Its broadcasts were, and still are, in Farsi, targeting audiences not just inside Iran, but also the Iranian diaspora around the world, really aiming to reach a specific, influential group.
And its stated aims were pretty transparent, too, weren't they? First, promote a more positive vision of the United States, kind of a direct counter to anti-American sentiment.
Sure.
And second, to actively promote the struggle for freedom and self-determination in Iran. And they did this by blending news with music, trying to appeal to that audience.
It's a direct attempt to influence public opinion abroad. A classic soft power approach, you could say, compared to military or economic pressure.
So what kind of impact did it actually have? Did it work?
Well, what's really fascinating here is the immediate and often pretty aggressive counter-response it provoked from the Iranian government.
So they didn't ignore it.
Far from it. This illustrates the direct information warfare that was going on. They reacted swiftly, actively fighting back. Our sources detail how Iran actually went as far as purchasing jamming technology from Cuba.
Jamming tech. from Cuba.
Yes, specifically designed to restrict access to Radio Farda for its listeners inside Iran. This wasn't a subtle pushback. It was basically a declaration that the airways themselves were a battleground.
Wow. Access to information is a contested prize.
Absolutely. And this jamming, while maybe not totally effective, certainly showed how concerned the Iranian government was about Radio Farda's message.
And Iran didn't just play defense, did they? They went on the offensive too. They launched their own Arabic language TV station, Al Alam.
Meaning the world, yes.
That seems like a clear attempt to project Iranian influence, particularly in places like Iraq, especially with all the U.S. accusations swirling around about Iran sponsoring terror or its nuclear program.
It's a battle of narratives, exactly. Playing out across the airwaves, each side trying to control the message and shape perceptions in a really volatile region.
And there was another front in this info battle too, right? Blogging.
Yes. Interestingly, our sources highlight the surprising popularity of blogging among young people in Iran.
Surprising because the government clamps down on dissent.
Precisely. Despite the Iranian government's pretty stringent control over public discourse and their known practice of arresting bloggers for expressing political dissent in their online diaries.
Right.
Blogging remains a really popular form of electronic communication, especially for the youth.
So it shows the resilience of informal channels.
I think so. It showcases the resilience of these informal information channels and that enduring human desire for expression, even when facing state control and real personal risk. It's a stark reminder that even well-funded state media can be challenged by decentralized grassroots information flows.
Okay, so let's broaden out again. Why does popular geopolitics matter so much? It's not just some niche academic topic. It feels profoundly practical.
It really is.
Our sources note, it's perhaps surprising that geopolitical writers didn't focus on it earlier, given how important media clearly is in shaping how we understand and interact with the world. Why do you think that gap existed?
That's an excellent question, and it does point to maybe a historical oversight. Perhaps traditional geopolitics focus so much on the state actors, the military might, the grand strategies.
Just fun power.
Exactly, that it underestimated the subtle, pervasive influence of cultural products. Yet each of us, as the source points out, has this unique media signature.
Right, that mix of papers, radio, TV, internet.
Yeah, the combination of newspapers we read, radio stations we listen to, TV shows we watch, internet sources we access and interact with daily. This unique signature profoundly shapes our worldview, often without us even realizing it.
So it makes popular geopolitics central to how individuals engage.
Absolutely central. It determines what information we prioritize, which narratives we accept, and ultimately how we might act or react to world events. It's not trivial at all.
And since the 20th century, mass media has just radically intensified and accelerated global connectivity, hasn't it?
Totally.
It connects people, places, events in ways that, well, sometimes feel undesirable, maybe overwhelming. Bringing distant conflicts or cultures right into our living rooms, creating this sense of immediacy, this urgency that just wasn't possible before. We see images from far-flung crises almost instantly.
Yes, but, and this is a critical point, our sources really underscored the production, circulation, and consumption of news remain inherently uneven and unequal.
How so?
Well, large Euro-American corporations, think CNN International, Time Warner, News International, the BBC, they dominate the global information landscape.
Usual suspects.
Pretty much. They don't just report the news, they actively determine what is newsworthy. And crucially, how those stories get told.
Which influences how we see things.
Massively. It often influences how we distinguish between victims and perpetrators or exploiters and exploited. They effectively set a global agenda for what we pay attention to and how we interpret it.
So a few powerful voices shape the narrative for everyone.
To a large extent, yes. This concentration of media power means their framing often becomes the framing for a global audience, regardless of where the events are actually happening.
And this concentration leads to some really iconic moments being etched into our collective memory, often because of media. I mean, I can still vividly recall exactly where I was when I heard about 9/11, that immediate visceral impact.
Me too.
It's like media just burns these moments into our shared consciousness, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Think about President Kennedy's assassination or the fall of the Berlin Wall. These are moments almost universally recalled through their media representations.
Absolutely. And it's precisely because media has this immense capacity to shape and influence public opinion, both at home and overseas, that governments aren't just passive observers.
They'd get involved.
They actively seek to regulate, monitor, disrupt, sometimes even ban broadcasting. The Abu Ghraib prison scandal offers a truly chilling, concrete example of how weaponized that media power can become.
Yes, that's a powerful one. April 2004, CBS broadcast those images taken by U.S. servicemen's digital cameras,
Horrific images.
showing Iraqi prisoners being degraded, tortured at Abu Ghraib prison in Baghdad. The impact was immediate, devastating. It just reverberated globally.
And it completely undermined U.S. claims of moral authority in the conflict, didn't it?
Totally.
The Bush administration was forced into this rapid condemnation, trying to frame it as the work of just a few rotten apples, not a systemic issue.
Damage control.
Pure damage control. But for critics, both inside and outside the U.S., those photographs stood as this damning indictment of double standards, especially regarding human rights and democratic norms, particularly in the context of the war on terror.
And the images spread like wildfire online too, right?
Exactly. What's more, these images, which were already circulating online among soldiers apparently, were then circulated still further by those resisting the American occupation of Iraq. They became a potent weapon in the information war.
Fueling anti-American sentiment.
Hugely. And recruitment for insurgent groups. It's a stark reminder that in the digital age, controlling images is almost impossible. Once they're out, they're out.
And for many viewers in the West, maybe seeing those spectacular, shocking images made distant places like Iraq or later Lebanon suddenly appear immediate, proximate.
Yes.
It really brings home the human cost, the complexities of conflict in a way that maybe mere statistics or news reports just can't,
Yeah.
That visceral reaction to visual evidence.
It absolutely does. And this brings us back to framing. The true geopolitical leverage of media isn't just what gets broadcast, but how it's framed.
The invisible editorial hand.
That's a good way to think of it. The hand that decides which aspects of a story get highlighted, which words are used, what context is provided. This framing, which is a key term in media studies,
Right.
it isn't neutral. It's a powerful form of agenda setting. It guides public attention and, crucially, shapes our emotional and intellectual response to global events. It's how a story is explained, essentially setting the public's understanding.
And this framing isn't just academic jargon. It's happening constantly. In the language we hear every day, think about phrases like the war on terror or the war on drugs.
Loaded terms.
Definitely loaded. They're not neutral descriptions. By calling it a war, it immediately suggests an enemy, a battle, a justified conflict, a need for extreme measures, rather than, say, framing it as a public health crisis or a complex diplomatic challenge.
The words create the lens.
Exactly. The very words we use create the lens through which we see the problem. And it's not just big phrases. Place-based descriptions are critically important too.
Oh, hugely.
Imagine the public outrage if an Argentine broadcast referred to the Islas Malvinas as the Falkland Islands, or if a Palestinian broadcaster talked about Judea and Samaria instead of the West Bank.
It signals immediate allegiance or opposition.
Exactly. These terms aren't neutral. They carry immense political and historical weight.
And what's compelling here is how these selected frames can present two entirely irreconcilable geopolitical imaginations. Our sources use the example of the Israeli-Lebanese conflict. One frame might justify Israeli action because of the threat from Hezbollah, emphasizing national security, defensive measures.
Makes sense from that perspective.
Conversely, another frame might view the very same actions primarily through the lens of disproportionate damage to civilians and infrastructure.
Also makes sense from that perspective.
Right. Both are potentially valid viewpoints within their own frames, driven by different underlying moral grammars and priorities, but they simply cannot be reconciled within the same understanding of the conflict.
They were talking past each other.
Essentially. And this is why framing is so powerful. It can predetermine the very terms of the debate before it even begins.
And images, news broadcasting, they can also act as a powerful provocation, can't they? Compelling action.
Definitely. They can force hands. During the 2006 Israeli-Lebanese conflict, for instance, the continuous news coverage, the images of the unfolding crisis, put immense pressure on Western governments.
How so?
It pushed them to evacuate their citizens, and it pushed them to exert diplomatic pressure for a ceasefire. Media wasn't just reporting, it was actively driving policy decisions.
And images can have a truly long cultural afterlife, sometimes in chilling ways.
Yes, the sources mention a really chilling example. Osama bin Laden, in an October 2004 broadcast, explicitly recalled watching television pictures of Israeli jets hitting tower blocks in Beirut back in 1982.
He recalled that.
Explicitly. He stated that those images provided him with the very idea for the 9/11 attacks on American buildings.
Wow, that's profound and disturbing.
It really is. This isn't just about news being consumed and forgotten. It's about how images can inspire, provoke, even shape the geopolitical strategies of non-state actors decades later. It shows their profound, lasting, and sometimes devastating impact.
That's a truly powerful connection. Speaking of powerful images, let's turn to Hollywood. Section 4, Hollywood's geopolitical lens.
Right. The Dream Factory.
It's interesting, isn't it, that for much of the last century, the U.S. hasn't really experienced the direct ravages of war on its own soil in the same way other parts of the world have.
That's a crucial point.
Pearl Harbor and 9/11 are obviously significant exceptions, huge exceptions, but even those, tragic as they were, perhaps pale in scale compared to the conflicts endured in places like France or the Soviet Union during the World Wars.
Absolutely. And despite this comparatively limited direct experience of war on its own territory, Hollywood has been incredibly significant in upholding that old aphorism that war is often fought twice, once on the battlefield and once on film.
Right, I remember the quote from Wag the Dog. War is show business.
Exactly. It highlights how the narrative, the visual representation, the shaping of public perception are just as crucial, maybe sometimes more crucial, than the physical conflict itself. Hollywood provided this canvas for imagining what war would look like and how America would respond.
And precisely because America's direct war experience was, relatively speaking, more limited, Hollywood generated this whole series, this genre of national security cinema films. These movies imaginatively outline threats facing the U.S., from the very real dangers of Soviet forces and Nazis to the more fantastical but equally fear-inducing perils of, extraterrestrials or natural disaster.
It was like a national rehearsal for conflict, wasn't it? Exploring anxieties, solidifying national identity, figuring out who the enemy was, even if fictional.
Yeah.
And given Hollywood's just massive popularity both inside and outside the U.S., these films became, for many people around the world, their very first point of contact with America.
Wow, first contact via Hollywood.
Often, yes. They were and still are powerful shapers of America's image, its values, and the global understanding of its place in the world. They exported not just stories, but a particular geopolitical worldview.
Okay, let's dive into the Cold War narratives. The 1940s, 50s. Back then, most Americans never met a Soviet citizen, never traveled to the Soviet Union.
Completely different worlds.
So how did film, radio, and later TV play such a crucial role in shaping American impressions of the Soviet Union as this ominous red menace? And how did, at the same time, consolidate a sense of American self-identity, the land of the free, a beacon of democracy?
Well, it was a pretty concerted effort. What's fascinating is the remarkably close alignment between Hollywood production companies and key U.S. government departments, State Department, Defense Department during this period.
Yeah, how close?
Very close. The Pentagon, for example, didn't just sit back. It established a special liaison office in 1948 that actively shaped storylines. It determined the level of cooperation it would provide to film productions.
So they had script approval, basically.
Effectively, yes, if they wanted access to military hardware, personnel, locations. Films like The Longest Day in 1961 enjoyed direct Pentagon support tanks, soldiers.
Wow.
Even though apparently some U.S. military personnel had to be withdrawn from the set because the Berlin crisis was worsening at the time.
That shows how direct the link was.
It wasn't subtle. It was direct government influence on how narratives were constructed, ensuring they aligned with national security objectives.
And it extended to direct propaganda efforts, too, which were surprisingly overt sometimes. Frank Capra's Why We Fight series.
A classic example.
Not just entertainment, it was required viewing for all U.S. servicemen and women during World War II. Explicitly designed to boost morale, explain the Allied cause.
And even after the war, that influence continued. Our sources reveal the CIA secretly funded the animated film Animal Farm in 1954.
Secretly funded Animal Farm.
Yes, because George Orwell's anti-Soviet allegory was seen as just perfect propaganda for the Cold War ideological battle. That shows how far the government was willing to go to push a particular narrative into popular culture.
So what themes were common in these films?
Frequently themes of paranoia and vigilance. They subtly instilled this sense of perpetual threat. Movies like My Son John in 1952 highlighted the insidious power of communism, suggesting it could corrupt American youth from within. It focused on a family's struggle with the son they suspected was a Soviet sympathizer.
The enemy within.
Exactly. And then sci-fi films like Red Planet Mars or The Thing from 1951 focused on dangers posed by aliens, but the allegorical links to communism were pretty unmistakable.
How so?
An unseen, infiltrating, dehumanizing enemy. The collective message seemed to be, you need never-ending vigilance, both against external foes and against threats to the American way of life from inside.
These films really contributed to a specific geographical representation, too, didn't they?
Yeah.
America's openness seen as both a virtue and a vulnerability.
Yes.
And the Soviet Union, by contrast, depicted as this monolithic red menace, geographically huge, culturally uniform, godless, politically relentless in its ambition.
And some sections of Hollywood even pushed the idea that this threat was capable of, get this, subcontracting foreigners and possibly even space aliens to continue the struggle for world domination.
That's pretty wild. But it clearly shaped public perception, framed the geopolitical struggle in these stark, almost mythical terms.
And this conservative view wasn't just encouraged, it was heavily enforced by the political assault from the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC.
Ah, the Red Scare, McCarthyism.
Exactly. In the late 1940s, early 1950s, the infamous Hollywood 10 were jailed for refusing to answer questions about their political affiliation.
Refusing to name names.
Right. And the Red Channel's blacklist effectively denied employment to over 300 people, including huge figures like Charlie Chaplin, Orson Welles, judged to have a subversive past.
That must have had a chilling effect.
Immense. This political suppression just stifled any visual culture of dissent, ensuring the dominant narrative remained overwhelmingly conservative, aligned with government foreign policy. The cost to individual careers and to artistic freedom was huge.
But despite that stifling atmosphere, there were some rare voices of dissent, weren't there? A few films that managed to subtly critique the dominant view.
Yes, and it's important to acknowledge those exceptions. They show that even within a restrictive environment, alternative viewpoints could sometimes emerge, often through allegory or genre.
Like what?
Jack Arnold's? It came from outer space in 1953, for instance. It featured aliens who, surprisingly, condemned American xenophobia. It subtly portrayed small-town America as kind of bigoted and narrow-minded.
Interesting twist.
Stanley Kramer's On the Beach from 1959 depicted the chilling horrors of nuclear annihilation, directly questioning the whole logic of nuclear confrontation. It was a high-grossing film despite implicit government condemnation.
And High Noon.
Some saw Kramer's High Noon from 1952 as a powerful satire on HUAC. You know, the townspeople abandoning the marshal, much like many felt Hollywood stood by while colleagues were blacklisted.
Subtle critiques.
Very subtle, often. But retrospectively, it's pretty clear that Hollywood was definitely at its most conservative during the most intense phases of the Cold War. The 40s, 50s, and then again in the 1980s.
Ah, yes, the 80s. Speaking of which, I vividly recall watching Red Dawn from 1984. It opens with that truly shocking scene. Soviet and Cuban paratroopers landing on an American high school football field.
Unforgettable opening.
And then it follows these high school kids forming a resistance group, the Wolverines, fighting back. Pure Cold War drama.
And other films like Top Gun in 1986 just celebrated American technological prowess, hypermasculinity. It was basically a recruitment ad for the Navy, wasn't it?
Pretty much. These films were pure Cold War geopolitical messaging, Reagan-era style.
And fact and fiction frequently blurred during this time, showing how deeply embedded these cinematic narratives became. President Reagan himself famously referenced the filmic exploits of Rambo to explain security threats facing the American people.
Who actually used Rambo?
He did, essentially using a fictional character to validate real-world policy. It wasn't just entertainment. It was presented as a direct visual tool for understanding, even justifying, national security initiatives.
That blurring really shows Hollywood's power to shape perception, even at the very top.
Absolutely.
And then after the 1991 Gulf War, the shift in who the enemy was became even more apparent, right? The Soviet Union was gone.
The primary foe vanished, yes. So films started depicting Islamic terrorists operating from the Middle East more often. Think Iron Eagle in 1985, Navy SEALs also in 1985. Though those were slightly earlier, the trend intensified.
And how were those places and people portrayed?
Often as irrational, demonic, and prone to violence, especially against American and Western interests. This kind of imagery deeply influenced how audiences perceived an entire region and its diverse peoples.
Which must have been deeply concerning for Arab American groups.
Absolutely. They rightly felt their community was being unfairly aligned wholesale, with terrorism and anti-American activity. It perpetuated really harmful stereotypes.
And what about the former Soviet Union after the Cold War? Was it just forgotten?
Not entirely off the hook, no. It was often depicted as chaotic, fragmented, a source of rogue nukes, terrorism, arms trafficking in films like Goldine 1995 or Air Force One in 1997.
So still a source of threat, just a different kind.
A different kind, yes. Although it's worth noting, some films offered a more nuanced view. Hunt for Red October in 1990, where a Soviet submarine captain seeks to defect to the U.S., presented a glimpse of individual agency, a desire for freedom within that system.
And before 9/11, those post-Cold War films depicting terror acts in the U.S., they were mostly suggestive or focused on domestic threats, right?
Largely, yes. Think Speed in 1994, a disgruntled former cop plants bombs. Or The Rock in 1996, showing domestic terror carried out by disillusioned American military officers.
So not really grounded in the kind of international terrorism experience that came later.
Not in the same way. It wasn't until after 9/11 that Hollywood responded in a dramatically different way, reflecting just how profoundly the attacks impacted the national psyche.
Indeed. Now, Hollywood was quickly mobilized, wasn't it, by the George W. Bush administration, as part of the response to 9/11 and the subsequent war on terror.
Yes, the cultural landscape shifted dramatically. Films that were actually produced before 9/11 but released afterward, like Collateral Damage in 2002 or Some of All Fears in 2001, they were consumed very differently, recontextualized by the trauma.
And did they change the plot of Some of All Fears?
They did. In the Tom Clancy novel, Muslim extremists were responsible for the nuclear attack on an American city. In the film, they changed it to rogue Russian experts.
Why the change?
It seems like a conscious decision to move away from potentially sensitive or inflammatory depictions right after 9/11, perhaps to avoid fueling further anti-Muslim sentiment domestically at that raw moment.
Okay, so if we look at post-9/11 films generally, our sources help draw some key conclusions about Hollywood's ongoing role in popular geopolitics. What's the first one?
First, it's clear that Hollywood's motion picture industry continues to be closely associated with U.S. government bodies, especially the Pentagon. Access to military equipment, expertise often comes in exchange for some level of script input or alignment.
Okay, so that connection persists.
Second, despite its often liberal reputation, Hollywood films tend to be pretty politically conservative in their underlying geopolitical messages. They usually reflect the prevailing political climate and broadly support established foreign policy.
With some rare exceptions.
With rare exceptions, yes. Films like Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove or Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11 stand out precisely because they boldly challenge the norm, and they often face significant backlash for doing so.
Got it. Third conclusion.
Third, the representations of places and peoples in films really matter. We mentioned Arab American groups voicing strong concerns about films like The Siege in 1998 and Rules of Engagement in 2000.
Okay.
Critics argued these films depicted Arabs and Muslims in overwhelmingly negative, stereotypical ways, aligning entire communities with the threat of terrorism. The impact of those representations is significant.
And finally, the fourth point.
Fourth, as both Presidents Reagan and George W. Bush demonstrated, films can provide a powerful visual tool. They help citizens imagine and understand why America might be planning a particular course of action. They serve as a form of cultural justification.
Like President Bush using the Iranian film Kandahar.
Exactly. Using that 2001 film to justify American intervention in Afghanistan by showing the deprivation and suffering there under the Taliban, it helped contextualize the decision, generate public support.
So ultimately, these films have considerable popular geopolitical significance, especially in a media-saturated culture like the U.S.
Immense significance. And many post-9/11 productions like United 93 or World Trade Center, both from 2005, they reinforced this trend of providing comfort and reassurance for a traumatized nation.
How did they do that?
Often by concentrating on individual acts of heroism, sacrifice, reinforcing that geographical and moral understanding of the U.S. as an innocent victim of terror.
Which then legitimizes the response.
Which then helps legitimize the subsequent war on terror as a necessary, justified response. They framed the conflict in these stark, almost mythic terms of good versus evil.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Beyond traditional Western media, let's explore how newer platforms are shaping geopolitics, starting with a really significant player, Al Jazeera.
Ah, yes, Al Jazeera. The Qatari-based news channel launched back in 1996. It occupies this really unique, often controversial position on the global media stage.
Unique how?
Well, it's supported by the Emir of Qatar, a tiny but incredibly wealthy country thanks to vast natural gas reserves. And notably, Qatar also hosts a large American airbase.
So that creates an interesting paradox.
It does. A state-funded media outlet from a U.S. ally, yet often quite critical of U.S. policy. It operates in this intriguing geopolitical space.
And it quickly established a reputation for being different, didn't it? Compared to other Arab language broadcasters.
Very different. Many other outlets were state-controlled, heavily censored. Al Jazeera benefited partly because Qatar abolished government censorship in 1998, giving it a surprising degree of editorial freedom for the region.
And it used that freedom.
It did. It tackled controversial social, cultural, political issues head-on. And groundbreakingly, it would broadcast Israeli officials speaking in Hebrew, offering a platform to voices rarely heard directly in Arab media at the time.
That must have raised eyebrows.
It certainly did. And its coverage of the U.S.-UK bombing campaign of Iraq in December 1998, Operation Desert Fox, that really cemented its reputation as a distinctive voice.
Oh, so.
Despite being condemned as a propaganda mouthpiece by some Western and even other Arab governments, its raw, often unedited footage contributed to a completely different framing of Iraq.
Different from the Western narrative.
Very different. It showed Iraq not just as some abstract enemy state, but as an inhabited, civilized place where ordinary people were bearing the brunt of the attacks. It challenged the sanitized narratives often presented elsewhere.
So it shifted perceptions, especially in the Arab world.
Critically, it was a major shift in how the conflict was perceived globally, but particularly across the Middle East.
And it famously became Osama bin Laden's media outlet of choice, didn't it? Broadcasting his interviews, his video messages.
Yes, that move was heavily criticized by regional governments, by the West.
Understandably.
But it also challenged the existing representations of him as simply demonic or mad. By showing his austere existence, his rhetoric, his strategic thinking, it presented him, perhaps disturbingly for some, as a deliberate, calculated actor, not just a caricature.
That's complex.
Very complex. And Al Jazeera's comprehensive, often quite graphic coverage, particularly of the Palestinian Intifada starting in 2001, put real pressure on Arab governments, on the Israelis, on the Americans.
Pressure to do what?
To rethink their own media strategies. For instance, the Israeli Broadcasting Authority actually developed an Arabic language channel, partly in response to Al Jazeera's influence, recognizing they needed to counter its narrative. Al Jazeera really provoked and pressurized.
And it certainly earned the disapproval of the American and British governments along the way.
Oh, definitely. For its willingness to broadcast graphic images of victims of Allied bombs, for airing claims by resistance forces, things seen as legitimizing the opposition.
And wasn't its office bombed?
Infamously, yes. Its Kabul-based bureau was bombed by a U.S. missile, killing a reporter, a deeply controversial event that further strained relations, and this happened even while the U.S. was running a shared values campaign, trying to convince Muslims they were welcome in the U.S.
A direct contradiction in messaging.
Stark contradiction. And what's truly fascinating here is how bin Laden continued to leverage Al Jazeera. He used it as his favored medium for broadcasting messages that powerfully inflamed anti-American and anti-Israeli sentiment.
And our sources talk about his own popular geopolitics.
Yes, they delve into how sophisticated it was. He skillfully blended geographical cross-referencing, historical analogies, critiques of colonialism, Islamic scriptures, all to frame the U.S. as this crusading state intent on dominating Muslim lands and the Islamic community as imperiled.
And that chilling connection to the Beirut images again.
Yes. The source notes again that his recall of those 1982 TV pictures of Israeli jets hitting tower blocks in Beirut provided him with the very idea for the 9/11 attacks. It profoundly illustrates the enduring, devastating influence of media images as catalysts for geopolitical action, how a single visual can resonate and inspire for decades.
Truly sobering. Okay, let's turn finally to the internet. A truly double-edged sword for geopolitics, as you said earlier.
Absolutely. Since the 1980s, its growth has been championed, hasn't it? For encouraging social interaction, shrinking geographical distance, connecting people across continents.
Right.
The U.S. remains the biggest user and information producer, though we absolutely must acknowledge the persistent digital divide. This connectivity isn't universal by any means.
And while the internet connects people in positive ways,
it has also provided a significant and really challenging medium for terror networks like Al-Qaeda.
how so?
It's used for fundraising, for sending encoded messages, for radicalization, for publicizing their activities, reaching a global audience instantly. And governments find it extremely difficult to police effectively.
Because it's so decentralized.
Exactly. Websites can be shut down but quickly reemerge with different addresses. They constantly adapt to evade control. It's this perpetual cat and mouse game for intelligence agencies.
But on the flip side, the internet has been absolutely crucial for social movements, right? Particularly the anti-globalization movement.
Hugely important, enabling what our sources call e-mobilization and e-protest. Think back to the WTO Seattle protests in 1999, largely organized online.
Right.
The internet allowed activists to exchange experiences, plan actions, circulate their own images and alternative reports to promote their viewpoints. It let them directly challenge the often unfavorable portrayals they received in mainstream media.
And the Zapatista movement in Mexico is cited as a key example.
A pioneering and really powerful example of this internet leverage. Back in the early 1990s, they recognized the internet and alternative media as crucial in their resistance against the Mexican state and the global economic order.
Even with low connectivity in their region.
Yes. Remarkably, despite very low internet connectivity in their remote region of Chiapas, they managed to build new networks of solidarity globally. They publicized their causes, indigenous rights, land dispossession, economic marginalization to an international audience, effectively bypassing traditional media gatekeepers.
Proving the power of networked resistance.
They really did.
This also brings up that constant tug-of-war between government control and online dissent. Post 9/11, governments worldwide brought in measures like the U.S. Patriot Act, increased surveillance in Britain.
All explicitly aimed at controlling information in the name of counterterrorism and national security. It's always framed as this delicate balance between security and civil liberties.
And we see this tension play out constantly, don't we?
All the time. Governments like China insist Google and other tech companies restrict access to banned pro-democracy sites, building their Great Firewall.
But people try to get around it.
Simultaneously, yes. Determined hackers, groups like the US-based Cult of the Dead Cow, remain dedicated to cracking these firewalls, creating tools and methods to circumvent state censorship. It's this ongoing digital cat-and-mouse game.
Between state control and digital freedom fighters, almost.
In a way. And what's also clear is the increasing significance of bloggers and citizen journalists in countries where the public sphere is tightly controlled. They provide dissenting opinions, alternative perspectives, despite often facing harassment and surveillance. They act as vital, albeit risky, conduits of information.
And it's not just in tightly controlled regimes either. Even in the U.S., our sources highlight how liberal academics, commentators use websites, Think Progress, Daily Kos are mentioned to rigorously monitor mainstream media.
Yeah, they act as watchdogs.
Highlighting distortions, providing this vital counterblast to justifications for things like the war on terror. They even successfully pushed ABC to make changes to their documentary, The Path to 9/11.
That's right. By meticulously highlighting its historical inaccuracies and problematic framing, it shows the power of organized online critique, even against major networks.
So the internet really functions as this dynamic forum for alternative narratives, for holding traditional media and government narratives accountable.
It absolutely does. It allows for this continuous, decentralized critique and reframing of geopolitical events. It shows that popular geopolitics isn't just about top-down messaging from governments or Hollywood.
It's bottom-up, too.
It's also bottom-up resistance, reframing, this constant battle for influence over public understanding. The sheer volume and speed of information flow online create an unprecedentedly complex and contested media landscape.
Wow. What a journey this deep dive has been. I mean, from blockbuster films setting the stage for national security narratives,
Right back to the Cold War.
to governments directly sponsoring radio stations like Radio Farda, and from the groundbreaking rise of Al Jazeera as a counter-narrative,
A huge disruptor.
to the incredibly powerful and often unpredictable double-edged sword of the internet. We've really seen how popular geopolitics permeates nearly every form of media we consume.
I think the core takeaway here, I think, is that media is just far from being a passive pipe delivering information.
It's active.
It's incredibly active. It shapes our perceptions. It profoundly influences policy decisions by creating public buy-in or maybe public outrage. And it serves as this crucial battleground for competing narratives about our world, our identities, the complex relationships between nations.
It's where the abstract becomes concrete, maybe. The distant becomes immediate.
That's a great way to put it, yes.
So as you, our listener, go about your day consuming news, watching shows, scrolling through social media, we leave you with this thought to mull over. In this increasingly interconnected world, just inundated with information, how can you cultivate a more critical approach to the geopolitical messages you encounter daily?
How can you spot the moral grammars?
How can you identify the framing that's at play? And maybe what is your own role, however small it might feel, in shaping or influencing the collective understanding of our complex global landscape?
It's a question that really demands continuous reflection, doesn't it? A kind of constant vigilance against those unseen influences. We really encourage you to continue your own deep dive into these fascinating connections between media, power, and perception.
Until next time, keep digging.